So DC Superhero Girls is a thing, and apart from having an atrocious name, it is awesome. If you're anything like me and you were left bereft and purposeless after the end of My Little Pony Friendship is Magic, then I would highly suggest you try this show as a means of filling that hole. I only caught a short clip of this show, and I was immediately interested in the charming cartoon style. It's sleek and current, but heavily reminiscent of Dexter's Lab or the Powerpuff Girls. So I watched the whole thing, and I was not disappointed at all. It has a lot of the same feel as My Little Pony, with a cast of characters that all have their own distinct personalities that are thoroughly explored over the course of the 52 episodes of the only season that is currently aired. The way these characters come with their own flaws and strengths, and the conflict between characters is incredibly similar to the dynamics and structure of Friendship is Magic. The biggest difference I would say is the fact that physical altercations actually happen. This is a superhero show, so it's more like the Powerpuff Girls in that respect. There isn't this apprehension around pulling punches because ponies aren't supposed to fight because fighting isn't girly and then girls won't buy toys. I've been purposefully beating around the bush with this because I want to sell you the show on its own merits, but there is a reason the show feels so much like what I've been missing from My Little Pony Friendship is Magic. It's because the show was written and created by the absolute wizard of animation herself, Lauren Faust. Which also explains why the characters look a certain way. She worked on Foster's Home for Imaginary Friends. So yes, the creator of Friendship is Magic made DC Superhero Girls. I'm hoping maybe if I say it enough times, the name will get better. The show is filled with funny characters with real goals and shortcomings that get in their own way. Stories range from hilarious escapades about being a teenage girl learning to drive to alien overlords coming to subjugate the Earth. It's a superhero show, that was bound to happen. The characters balance their normal lives and secret identities with their superpowers, and there's occasionally a super catchy musical number thrown in for good measure. This show is really something special in its own right, and the feeling of similarity to My Little Pony is not just because the creator is the same, but because the creative team behind this show are actually just good writers, plain and simple. This is evident in the fact that this is a superhero show centered around girls in the modern day, in how the writers deviate from the history of female superheroes in comics, and how they take particular care to make sure female characters are treated appropriately regarding their own goals and narrative trajectories. This isn't just a show about female superheroes teaming up, it's about 6 fully realized characters who happen to be female, reaching their goals and growing up. And so today, I want to talk about DC Superhero Girls. And it's not because that name is any good. Much like Friendship is Magic, this is not the first iteration of DC Superhero Girls. It's the second generation. Warner Bros. Animation had previously created a show called DC Superhero Girls in 2015, with a bunch of web shorts promoting a series of movies that all led into one another. These movies were supported by a bunch of Lego movie spin-offs and books aimed at younger girls. Where this gets even crazier is that Lauren Faust had already created a show around Supergirl, Batgirl, and Wonder Girl as a short-form cartoon for DC Nation Shorts. This is the same television event that led to Teen Titans Go! I can only imagine that the first generation DC Superhero Girls was already in development and someone at the studio decided that they were going to continue with that direction. Because seriously, Faust's original shorts are amazing, and Super Best Friends Forever is a way better name than DC Superhero Girls. But in 2017, DC Animation announced that DC Superhero Girls would be getting a complete overhaul visually, and the show would be handled creatively by Faust and serve as a more direct translation of the Super Best Friends Forever, albeit with a few changes based off the first generation. They even had Nicole Sullivan, Tara Strong, and Grey DeLisle reprise their roles from the shorts and added 3 more superheroes to the roster. Actually, in a lot of ways, this is everything that I hoped Equestria Girls would have become. The show premiered before the Teen Titans Go to the Movies movie as a short to promote the series. Spoilers to follow, so be warned. The show follows Wonder Woman, who was changed from Wonder Girl, as she enters
the world of man
to dispel evil. Meanwhile, Barbara Gordon, or Babs, has just moved from Gotham to Metropolis and is attending Metropolis High, where she uses her impressive detective skills in combination with what I can only assume is a very bad case of ADHD to deduce that Kara Danvers, Diana Prince, Jessica Cruz, Z Zatara, and Karen Beecher are actually Supergirl, Wonder Woman, the Green Lantern, Zatara, and Bumblebee. Babs is obsessed with Batman and becoming a superhero, and so she's already created the persona of Batgirl. She then convinces the others to let Diana teach them how to be superheroes. They then proceed to save the day and get into all kinds of cartoon mischief as they learn how to be friends and heroes. So far, the show has been really well received, but it only has 1 season. The second one is set to start in the summer of 2021, so now is the time to get caught up. Apart from being a really good watch on the grounds of humor and writing, the show is noticeably led by females. I think this is important because in case you've been living under a rock for the past decade and a half, the world has gone superhero crazy. Every year, huge blockbuster movies come out and make millions of monies. They are everywhere on television too, and not just for children, but in serialized shows directed at adults on traditional television and streaming platforms. And yet, despite this massive new popularity, there are only a handful of movies from Marvel or DC that feature women in the lead. And one of them was a sequel. And as cool as it was to see Wonder Woman be lucrative enough that it could get a sequel, it hardly counts as 2 female superhero movies. And I'm not including movies like Elektra. Cartoons have always had a place for superheroes, but even amongst them I can only think of a handful that feature females, and even less that people care about. The Powerpuff Girls, the new Harley Quinn. Anime's got all its magical girls, but that's about all I got. Not to belabor the point, but if these movies do so well, why don't we have as many superhero movies about women as we do men? And don't think for a minute that this is a problem with just superhero movies. This is something that occurs in a lot of media, but I think it's worth pointing out that this show has 6 female superheroes as the leads. There are male characters in the show, but the show focuses on the females, without undermining the males. It places them both on equal footing, but just happens to be about the females. As far as superhero shows go, I think this one's kind of unique. Anyone who's familiar with comics will tell you that every character, small or large, has an in-depth backstory. It's hard to find a new story to tell about certain comic book characters because their origin has been told and retold over and over. It's the reason Spider-Man Homecoming didn't include the origin story. Everyone already knows it. It's not unusual for comic books and their characters to get rebooted so the writers aren't stuck, but audiences still expect those characters to go through the same basic events. Bruce Wayne isn't Batman if his parents don't die. But DC Superhero Girls has its own canon. First of all, the characters are in high school rather than adults. This makes the characters more relatable to younger audiences because even though they're super, they're still in school and they go through the usual adolescent issues.
It was Barbara Gordon!
None of the characters adhere very closely to their comic counterparts. Diana is an adult before she leaves Themyscira. Barbara never lived in Metropolis because her dad has always famously been the commissioner of Gotham PD. And the list goes on. This is awesome because you can be familiar with the archetype of these characters and some of their backstory, but it's also not required to have intimate knowledge of their lives because they often are changed for this show. Take Kara, for example. Traditionally, Supergirl is played as her cousin's counterpart, the perfect, kind, and sweet girl who stands up for hope and justice and protecting those who can't protect themselves. But in this show, she's obnoxious, flaky, rebellious, and at times overbearing to the point of pushing Karen around. It's a different take, and it works because otherwise she might be too much like Diana, who's all of those things, but also a hilarious fish out of water.
Beware, Caitlin! Aiden attacks! Ah! No, Diana! He's just going to kiss her.
Rebooting and changing comic characters is not new, but in this case it allows the writers the freedom to explore female characters in a way that's deeper than just the femme fatale or standard female do-gooder. Main characters and villains are both different from their comic book counterparts. These new versions also have a lot of emphasis on being their own versions. The decision to change these characters for a new show also means that these characters have the chance to break out of the long and interesting history of women in comics. Historically, comics have almost always been a male-oriented media in the West. That doesn't mean that women have not been interested or depicted, but comic books and the superheroes that dwell within them were delegated by the industry that makes them to be directed at young boys for the majority of the gold and silver age of comics. As the sales of comic books started to dwindle in the Bronze Age, there was a pivot in the way women were depicted in comics. In what is now called the Dark Age of comics, because of how comics got more gritty and violent, comic book creators decided instead of trying to increase their fan base, they would double down on this male-oriented medium. Thus began the phenomenon known as hard bodies. You know, where women superheroes, and often any women in the comics, were drawn with exaggerated features in order to increase their sex appeal for young male readers. And I'm not just talking about breasts and butts, but like eyes and lips and hair was all drawn in purposefully hyperbolic ways. Kinda creepy if you ask me. Women have always been in comics, but the way they're portrayed has been a bit weird, to put it lightly. Even Wonder Woman has been agonized over by academics because she was created by a man and her strange origins rooted in bondage. Yeah, look that up. Both the origins and the academic discourse. The former is downright bizarre, but the latter is exceedingly interesting. DC Superhero Girls has given itself the opportunity to tell a story directed at females about females, and because it's not a comic nor drawn in the comic style, it easily sheds a lot of the issues surrounding that medium's history and even contemporary problems. Up until this point, I've been mostly focusing on what makes this show unique as a cartoon about female superheroes. But in order to go deeper into this topic, I want to look at film criticism regarding how females are portrayed, and that means I need to talk about the F word. No, not fuck, I say that all the fucking time. I'm talking about feminism. Dun dun dun. But actually, it's not scary, or really all that intimidating at all. It's just another branch of philosophy or criticism that can be applied to many things, in this case films and comics, as another lens of understanding how something works. It's mostly about how women are portrayed in media, but today specifically, I'm going to be looking at how women are written as characters in a narrative regarding DC superhero girls. That name is not getting any better. In pop culture, there's one name that gets thrown around all the time when talking about women in film and narrative. Named after Alison Bechdel, the Bechdel Test, or Bechdel-Wallace test, was named after a comic she wrote where two of her characters expressed that they weren't interested in watching movies that did not have at least two women in it that had a conversation that wasn't about a man. Humor is a great tool for criticism, and the Bechdel test was born because of the way it jabbed at how movies focus on men. The test consists of 3 rules outlined in this conversation. The first, there must be 2 female characters. The second, these characters must have a conversation. And the third, that conversation cannot be about a man. It's pretty simple, and yet you would not believe how many movies fail this test. Spoilers, because the answer is most of them. It's a shame because this is such a low fucking bar. It's embarrassing to say the least. Nowadays, most studios and companies actually have a rating system for how well a script passes this test, and it's a step in the right direction for female representation in film and television. But here's the thing. Despite the Bechdel test being a low bar and the fact that the majority of movies don't pass, the Bechdel test is kind of stupid. There. I said it, and I'm not apologizing for it. The bar is set so low because it's a humorous indictment on most movies for not being able to pass what should be a no-brainer, but it also creates a very low bar that can in fact be passed with very little brains. Hang on a second, I hear you say. I thought you were in favor of female representation in films, Janglez. Why would you not want movies to feature female characters having a conversation not about a man? Well, the answer is simple. The test reveals nothing about a character's goals or the depth of that conversation. Here's an example from Rick and Morty where they're clearly making fun of the Bechdel test. See if you can spot the problem.
Mom, can I try your tea?
Yes, Summer. Yes, try my tea.
It's so good. It's so warm.
Notice how absurdly devoid of life these characters are? Now, this was of course a joke on the writer's part, but the goals of these characters are not deep, and yet it passes the test, which is why I think it's stupid. Of course, there are a lot of movies that don't pass this test, but there are plenty that do. And critics can argue till the end of days about whether the women need to be named characters or whether an offhanded mention of a male character counts as about, but really the test is still dumb because it says nothing about the conversation or goals of those female characters. Certain TV movie Christmas card companies that shall go nameless, airs movies almost weekly that pass the Bechdel test, but regarding the goals of those characters, I'm not really sure anyone would claim them to be well-rounded or good representations of real women.
Great job, Morty. A feminist masterpiece.
I'm not alone in my criticism. Feminist scholars and media critics have come up with other tests, such as the hilariously and appropriately named Sexy Lamp test, posited by Kelly Sue DeConnick, which states that if you can replace your character with a sexy-looking lamp and nothing changes in the plot, maybe you need to rethink your character. Or the less hilariously named, but just as hilarious in practice Furiosa test, which dictates that a movie is feminist if men on the internet get butthurt because there are too many women in the movie, or a female is on screen for too long, which actually happened because of the character Furiosa and her peers being the focus of the newest Mad Max movie, which caused internet bros to boycott it. Not hilariously named at all is the Mako Mori test, named after the character from Pacific Rim, as she has a well-written 3-dimensional character with goals that go beyond just being about her relationship to a man. Her goals are incidental to the male leads around her and play into the story at large, but she's not controlled or delineated by the goals of others. This results in her being connected to the males she knows, but that she is free in terms of her own agency within the story. I like the Mako Mori test a lot because it places more emphasis on determining how a female character is portrayed, but even this does not break down what kinds of goals that female characters are written to have. I think the best way to show this is to compare the differences between DC Superhero Girl's first generation and its second current state. Now, I think the first generation was fine. I actually really like the design of Supergirl in particular, but these characters all look the same apart from a few minor differences. And I'm not talking about skin tones or representation, more about their facial structure and body type. Other than their costumes, they're basically the same person. Kind of doll-like. But in the writing, I mean, the characters in Generation 1 do have goals and save the day, and the goals are often related to interpersonal problems, but it just feels boring. The characters are not fully realized beyond their names, and there seems to be this emphasis on saving the day and making sure everyone is friends and that they all look pretty while doing it. And there's nothing wrong with looking pretty, but all the characters look the same, so what does that tell us about what pretty means and by whose standard? As a result of this, the goals the characters achieve feel empty because I'm not invested in these bland cookie-cutter stand-in cardboard cutout characters. When stakes are raised, there's no emotional reaction because the goal is to save the day? But at what cost? What is given up or lost to achieve these goals when everyone is friends and gets to look pretty at the end of the movie? In contrast, the new Super Best Friends Forever style superhero girls has characters that are different body shapes and have distinctive attributes and goals and flaws.
Dude, your mom looks like a final boss.
They argue and sometimes screw up and very often have goals that directly contradict their friends' goals as a means of conflict. It's also way more frenetic. Babs in particular is not generally idealistically pretty and is sometimes downright ugly, but in an endearing way. That makes her character more human and relatable. There are detractors from this kind of critique, though. They claim that tests like the Makomori test are based on personal opinion, and the Bechdel test is superior because it relies on easily identifiable data points rather than just interpretation. Still a dumb test, if you ask me. Building off this quantitative idea, some academics have started using computer modeling of character networks in narratives to quantify how females influence the stories they are in by creating diagrams that show how central these characters are to the plot visually. They are then able to represent these characters' interactions and mentions with lines to show just how much power or influence they have on the network that they are a part of, through the number of times that they are mentioned or the number of times that they interact with or affect change on other characters. This is incredible work, and I want more of it, but I actually think it's not totally necessary. Not that they should ever stop doing this. But I just don't see why art shouldn't be based on opinion. I think having quantifiable tests such as the Bechdel test or computer modeling of actor network theory are great tools that can be used, but so is classical rhetorical criticism of the character or a piece of art. I think criticism is at its best when people have disagreements about characters. The best debates are like the characters they are about. They're paradoxical, infuriating, and often inconclusive. I would argue that if you can have a real debate about whether a character is feminist or not, that would mean that the art is at least interesting, and on some level the female character in question has some traits that make people see her that way. And DC Superhero Girls has this in spades. There's this sick moment where they even call out Wonder Woman for having a crush on Steve Rogers, and it's super insightful.
You're Wonder Woman! You're literally a symbol of female empowerment!
Leave her alone, Kara! This crush is natural and normal, and she'll deal with it on her own time and in her own way.
To be clear, I don't think the Bechdel test should be abolished. Having more female characters interact in a way that is not for the purposes of propping up the males around them is absolutely worth doing. I just don't think that the test accomplishes this on its own. Having great female characters doesn't mean that they need to be separate from men like the Amazonians of Themyscira, or that they need to have a conversation with another woman that isn't about a man. It just means that the way female characters are treated in the narrative needs to be just as in-depth, goal-oriented, and complex, or more so if the need be, as their male counterparts. And so the reason that this new DC Superhero Girls has the same feeling as My Little Pony isn't because they're so similar or have the same creative team. It's because of the way Faust and her team understand these characters in terms of their creative history, comic book history, and feminist history, and they simply just write good characters. They're not written differently from male characters other than the fact that they're female. And the result isn't a good show for females to watch, or that they convey a message that's good for girls. The result is a good show for anyone to watch, and it has a fucking fantastic message for everyone. And that is why DC Superhero Girls has a terrible name. I mean, is a great show about great superheroes who happen to be female. Here's my straight thoughts. I love the inclusion of these characters having secret identities and how that plays into the story. I absolutely adore Babs and her ludicrously over-the-top personality, but I'm torn between outright saying she's my favorite because I'm in love with Diana, because this is absolutely without a doubt the best version of Wonder Woman. I want to give a huge shout out to Arna Kais from Ghent University, whose master's thesis was a huge source of information. As always, you can check out all of my sources in the description. Oh, also the Super Best Friends Forever shorts are all freely available on YouTube, and I maintain that this is still a way better name than DC Superhero Girls. Hey, thanks so much for watching that episode. If you enjoyed it, feel free to give that like button a good old-fashioned pow. I am personally very excited for the DC Superhero Girls and Teen Titans Go crossover that's coming up soon. But let me know what you think about DC Superhero Girls, or Super Best Friends Forever down in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe so you can catch more awesome episodes of This Is a Thing, as well as our weekly podcast, the long and the short of it, and anything new that we've got coming down the pipeline. All that's happening right here on Cinemaster's Ultimate Timeline.